Welcome to The Storm and thank you for watching today on WYLN TV 35. Former reporter and editor of the Boston Globe, Ben Bradlee Jr. is my guest today. He was the editor who supervised the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation done by the Spotlight team, an investigation later portrayed in the movie Spotlight, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture. In addition to his own tremendous accomplishments as a reporter and editor, Ben comes from a strong pedigree in journalism. He is the son of the late Ben Bradlee, editor of The Washington Post, who supervised the team that broke the Watergate story. His late father is currently portrayed by Tom Hanks in the movie The Post, out in theaters this week. My guest today has been in our region, writing a book about the pivotal role Luzerne County voters played in shaping the 2016 presidential election. We'll discuss the premise of the book and have a broad discussion about the importance of integrity in journalism. After the break, Ben Bradlee Jr. Welcome back to The Storm. I am joined today by Ben Bradlee Jr. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, you're welcome. Good to see you.
I'm excited to have you here in our studio in Hazleton. Lots of things I want to ask you about, starting with what on earth brings you to Hazleton?
Luzerne County, it turns out, played a very interesting role in the election of Donald Trump. And I've been fascinated by Trump's emergence on the national political scene for the last few years, and wanted to write about him and was looking for a way into the story. And digging into the results of the election in Pennsylvania, I learned about Luzerne County. And you know, it's a traditionally Democratic county, which Obama carried twice. Correct. But interestingly, it surged in the other direction this last year, last election for Trump, and Trump won the county by 20 points. And he built up such a margin here that it was about 60 to 70% of his victory margin in the state of Pennsylvania. So without this county, Trump would not have won Pennsylvania, or perhaps the presidency, since, as you know, it came down to Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So I thought Luzerne County, and especially the crossover votes from Democrats to Republicans to vote for Trump, mostly the white working class, would be a good window into telling the story of this election, since I think at least half the country is still
trying to figure out what happened.
Yeah, surprised that we have this president.
Well, and that's why it's so interesting that you're doing this, because exactly that. I still think there are plenty of people trying to figure out how on earth it happened.
Right.
So your objective, your broad objective, is really to say, well, this appears to be a microcosm of perhaps what happened.
Exactly. And the idea is to find about 10 or 12 people who voted for Trump for different reasons, and writ large, that becomes the Trump coalition.
I want to ask you about, and it's really a larger investigative journalism question, but you're from Boston. You know, as I opened the show, I just reminded everybody that you were a reporter and editor for the Boston Globe for a long time. You've lived in Boston a long time. And I would, in general, say Boston is a pretty liberal place.
Yep.
I mean, it's a college town, etc. How do you, and politics being so personal, Ben, how do you, when you spend so much time in such a liberal place, and knowing how personal politics can be, how do you go into a project like this and divorce yourself from bias that you may have and enter it truly objectively?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. You know, I'm a reporter, basically, and I love to get immersed in interesting stories, and you know, it requires, I think reporting requires being a good listener. And yeah, you may have your own political views, and but you're approaching people in good faith. I find that they typically don't say, "Well, what are your politics?" I think the average person, if they're approached and on a project like this and asked to be interviewed, I find generally enjoy being interviewed. And they, you gradually develop a rapport with somebody, and then I find that they open up in good faith. And maybe it is a leap of faith, but
so you allow yourself to be surprised. You don't necessarily enter into something like this thinking that you're going to attain a certain end.
No. I mean, when I went into this, I didn't. I wrote a proposal to my publisher on why I thought Luzerne County would be a good window into a good vehicle to tell the story, if you will. But I went in with no preconceived notions about what I'd find.
Okay. And that's in general, I think, I believe in journalistic integrity. I said in the open of the show, the movie The Post, which is out right now, and it's a movie. Your late father is one of the characters portrayed in the movie by Tom Hanks. I know he believed in journalistic integrity and investigative journalism, and I'm concerned that the way that we're headed in this nation, investigative journalism is under attack right now. Perhaps it's cyclical. We went through this during the Vietnam era when there was a lot of tension between journalists and leaders of nation. I guess I'm trying to understand, is this a bump? Is this cyclical? Or is it this new wave that we're never going to break free of, this tension?
I think there's a lot of reasons why investigative reporting is struggling right now. First of all, it's because the newspaper business is struggling economically in the internet era.
Fighting with bloggers.
Well, no, I just mean economically. Newspapers across the country, particularly local and regional papers,
and they
are losing money and circulation because there's been a great migration online. That's how people, it seems, prefer to read, and advertisers have gone with them. Like classified advertising, say, used to be the bread and butter of newspapers. That's all migrated online. And so newspapers for the last 15 years, really, have been losing money. And there have been mass layoffs among newspapers. And it's still newspapers as opposed to television or radio, which have the most reporters. So they set the agenda still, newspapers. But as they've lost, as they've suffered economically, they've had to lay off typically more than half their newsrooms. So they're sort of a shell of what they used to be. And in that climate, a lot of editors have concluded incorrectly, in my view, that investigative reporting is a luxury that they can no longer afford. Because typically, like in the Globe, where I used to work in Boston, we had our investigative group was called the Spotlight Team, and those were 4 reporters that were off by themselves in a different part of the building, so somewhat in secret, because what they worked on, no one else was supposed to know about. And they could be out of the paper for 6 months at a time. In today's journalistic world, editors can't afford to have 4 reporters out of business. Right. They're going to put out the paper every day. Right. And so in that climate, a lot of editors are saying, we can't afford to do this anymore. But I think that's short-sighted because readers really want that. And it's one of the most important things that newspapers can contribute.
I want to pick up in the next segment talking about what readers want. So we're going to have to go to break there. We will be right back on The Storm. Welcome back to The Storm. I'm joined today by Ben Bradlee Jr., and we're talking about investigative journalism and integrity in reporting. And one of the things before we went to break you were talking about is really what people want and editors making some decisions about what people want. I wonder sometimes, do people want the truth anymore, or do they want to only digest or hear their version of the truth?
Yeah, so that's an important question. Because today, I think one of the most interesting parts about the about the country as a whole and newspapers, there seems to be no consensus on what a fact is anymore. Like you see this in politics all the time, and where this president and his administration, Kellyanne Conway, his campaign manager and now one of his top aides, coined the phrase alternative facts, which seems like an oxymoron, crazy on its face. Facts are facts, but you find in our totally polarized politics today that everyone is in their sort of liberal or conservative silo.
Yeah, because she would, in her silo, she would say, well, alternative facts, I mean alternative to fake news. So those would be alternative. In her, I would imagine that's what she means by that.
But you know, fake news is another term that's taken off, and that Trump really coined the phrase. Most of the time when he uses the term fake news, I think it means simply a story that he doesn't like.
Interesting.
Not that it's made up. I mean, very few newspapers that I know make stories up. It just doesn't happen. Now, maybe there's bias. That's another question, and an important question. But you know, on television we have Fox News, which is obviously conservative. We have MSNBC, which is obviously left. CNN, you know, I think originally tried to pitch itself in the middle, but now probably tilts left as well. And in this day and age, it seems that that's the way people want their news. They don't necessarily want it straight.
Well, it's almost like it isn't news. It's more like it's opinion and analysis versus news. I mean, when I watch, for example, Fox, one of my favorite people to watch is actually Catherine Herridge, who is their investigative reporter. And doesn't, I mean, oftentimes she's even pulled in by some other people to give opinion, and she doesn't really give opinion. And I tend to like the non-opinion side of it. But to your point earlier with newspaper, you know, with circulation being down and knowing that even with televisions, it's so ratings driven, is it that the facts aren't enough that to drive interest? Is that what these networks are thinking, these newspaper editors are thinking?
Yeah. Well, you know, we're in a 24-hour news cycle now, and people consume their news in very different ways. And you know, in the old days, not too long ago, like when I was working for a newspaper, you would work all day, produce a story for the morning's paper, and that would be it. Now everything is online, and you have to update your stories constantly. And so if you present a story that, you know, say that happened in the morning, and you write about it for the next day's newspaper as new news, well, it isn't new anymore because everyone has heard about it all day on the radio or television. So newspapers are starting to write their stories in a different way, without not simply straight with a yesterday in the lead, this happened. They try to spin it forward and say, what will the impact of this be? A story that everyone has heard about, so they want to add more analysis. But the analysis sometimes, the danger is, can creep into bias.
Right, right. And true investigation takes time. I mean, if you're up against the clock, and to your point, everything is just updating constantly.
Well, investigations, again, that's why it's falling by the wayside. You're not seeing as much of them. Not in the big papers like the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, Boston Globe to a certain extent, but because they still have the resources. But what I worry is that smaller papers, like maybe the Times Leader in Wilkes-Barre or the Standard Speaker, or that they don't have the resources as much as they used to, and it will be more difficult to let a reporter or two investigate something
really
for a month without being in the paper.
Right. So what would be then, knowing the climate that we're in, knowing what the newspapers are up against right now, what would be your advice to editors out there and to colleagues of yours in journalism living in this and trying to work in this time?
Yeah, well, I think that given where we are, there has to be sort of a paradigm shift in newspapers and reporting, that you can't be paper of record or all things to all people. You might have to not cover a school board meeting or something that looks fairly routine in favor of putting more of your chips on investigative reporting and really trying to break something original and big, which in the long term would have more impact than covering a school board meeting. But creeping into that niche, you're finding some papers that are filling that void by going hyper-local and covering the school board, so I think, this is still shaking out as to what each publication's role can best be.
Okay. I want to go to break there, and when we come back, I want to continue a bit more about some advice you would give, but I think I want to talk to you a bit about students of journalism right now, and sort of your experience, how you would guide them if they're thinking about pursuing that field now. But we're going to take a break first. We're going to be right back on The Storm. Welcome back to The Storm. So Ben, before the break, I talked about the fact that I wanted to get a little bit of, we were talking about advice, advice for colleagues of yours, you gave some, but I also like to, if there's a young person out there right now who's thinking about going to school and studying journalism, or in school and studying journalism, what advice would you give them?
Well, there's no denying that, as I said earlier, that newspapers and the media generally are struggling economically, and that there aren't nearly as many jobs as there once was. And you don't go into this business to get rich, unless you're a network news anchor. But I still think that, even though there may not be as many jobs, and that it might be hard to find a job, there are different platforms are emerging all the time, blogs and various
podcasts,
like that. Different ways into the business. And it's still, a profession that is vital to our democracy, and
I'm assuming that you want more folks to fight to do that deep digging investigative journalism,
definitely.
Because that's where your soul is.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's what's most important, and I think, our press freedom is being threatened now by this president, and there's a very interesting, which is fascinating. There's no denying, there's always a proper tension between the press and the presidency. I mean, it's the fourth estate, as the press is known.
Natural.
it's meant to serve as a check and balance on government. But this president, more than any in recent memory, perhaps not going back to Nixon,
challenges the press?
Blasts, not just challenge, but is hostile to the press. I mean, he tweets about fake news and the dishonest media every day. And some of his rhetoric is quite over the top, like reporters are enemies of the American people. I mean, you know, I think journalists are just as patriotic as anybody else in this country, and that's a bridge too far. And just yesterday, Trump said that he wants to tighten up libel laws in this country. This in the aftermath of this new book that's been very critical of him. But, you know, he's going to have a hard time tightening up libel laws without the court's approval and without violating the First Amendment. And most libel laws are governed by the states anyway, so he doesn't really have a lot to say about that. And if there's anybody that's libel-proof, it would be the President of the United States, because he's the ultimate public figure. You know, if I wrote something critical of you and that was unfair, you know, perhaps you could sue me because you're not a public figure. Oh, you got your TV show now, so maybe
yeah.
you're
I mean,
at
least
figure.
my mom's watching. My audience of one is watching. I hear you, but I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, just in closing, we have about a minute left. So, when is the book coming out, and can you share the working title of the book, Ben?
The working title is The Forgotten, which plays off Trump's phrase, the forgotten people, a group that's the group that he felt he appealed to and put him in the White House. People who were underrepresented, ignored by both parties, and who he felt weren't getting the attention that they deserved.
Well, well, thank you very much. I can't wait until the book comes out late 2018.
Aiming for October of this year.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Before the
well,
midterm elections.
We will look for it. Ben Bradlee Jr., thank you so much for coming on the show.
Pleasure.
And remember, when you look around and don't like what you see, don't complain about it. You can do something about it. Thank you for watching.